Good evening, class. I hope everyone is healthy and well. Today, in response to the chapter on knowledge, epistemology, I thought it would be helpful to go over Descartes' Meditations and each one in particular, some of the contributions, the summaries, and how does that leave us epistemologically in the situation of knowledge? So I thought I'd go over each one individually and then some reflections on the work as a whole. So let's start with the first meditation. One thing to keep in mind is that Descartes makes a distinction between philosophical doubting and practical doubting. He's going to doubt almost everything, and he's going to search for something that he can't doubt. But he's not practically doubting things. Like when he says, does the external world exist? This is a philosophical doubt. It's not a practical doubt. He's not actually worried about this, even though sometimes in the meditations it would appear as though he is. Right? So it's meditations on first philosophy, and first philosophy um, preoccupies itself with what exists, um, questions often referred to as metaphysical or ontological, and also how do we know? He's going to try to answer these. And in particular, he's going to try to prove the existence of God and the existence of the immortality of the soul. So this is what he hopes to accomplish by the end of all six meditations. So in the first meditation, he takes to doubting and he takes three phenomena and he sort of generalizes from the first two. And then the third phenomenon is more just a hypothetical, but the first two are phenomenologically real. The first phenomenon he looks at, he just generally calls the insane. These are people running around the streets who are not aware of who they are, of where they are, of what they're wearing, right? And so he gives the example of people who think that they're important in the sense of their nobility and think that they're rich and dressed in sort of like good clothing, but they're really not nobility and they're running around naked and not dressed in fancy clothing. And this is their lack of awareness. He just contributes to this general concept of insanity. And so he generalizes because such a phenomenon exists, he asks, well, how do I know that I'm not like that? Right? This is the first skeptical worry he has, the first doubt. He's like, how can I be sure that I'm not like that? Again, philosophical, not practical. He's not really doubting this. The second phenomenon, this is probably what he's most famous for, or the most famous example rather, is that of the dream. He says many times, I'm sitting here in a chair by my fireplace, watching the fire, and I'm certain of it as much as one can be. And then all of a sudden, I wake up and I'm in my bed, and I wasn't actually by the fire, even though my dream looked and was very convincing. According to my sensory experience, again, not real sensory experience, but the sensory experience in the dream, it seemed indistinguishable from reality, but I was mistaken. So, how, and then this is the philosophical part, how do I know now that I'm not dreaming, right? How can I be certain that I'm not? And again, many people bring up what we might call superficial solutions to this. They say, well, my dreams, for example, are not as detailed as my reality, or I think I'm dreaming and I wake up. But this won't really solve the problem because this could also just be a dream inside of a dream, or the criteria you have for distinguishing dreams from reality could themselves be all part of one larger dream. So this by itself won't answer the question. And the uh, third skeptical worry is more conceptual. He says, well, what if there's an evil genius or demon, something that is deceiving not only my reality, but the very concepts in which form my reality? So both the generally how he describes the insane and the person dreaming, still when they wake up, um, for the latter, when they wake up, they still believe that the concepts were real, right? Concepts such as space, time, quantity, quality, duration, these types of structures of the reality are real, or at least taken to be real. But perhaps this evil genius is deceiving Descartes about even the very structures utilized to conceptualize reality. So these are the three doubts that he has, and when he is done, this is about the time that he finishes his first meditation. He's doubted almost everything, right? And so we're left here asking, how do I know that my empirical sensory experiences are real? How do I know that the concepts in which I utilize to conceptualize reality are real? And he hasn't found a good answer to that yet. And so meditation two begins with him asking himself, what is it? Is there anything I can doubt? Because I basically doubted everything, but is there any one thing that I can't doubt? And he finds that the one thing that he is unable to doubt is that he's doubting. It's a performative contradiction. When he thinks, "Could I be doubting that I'm doubting?" He automatically proves that he isn't, because that itself is doubting. Then he'll take the next step and generalize into a form of thinking. Right? Doubting is just a form of thinking in which there are many, and this is his famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And then this again is generalized into the idea that he is a thinking thing, right? And so what he is a thinking thing. And this is where the Cartesian dualism really comes into being. Also in his other work, the Discourse on Methods, it comes into being. But in this particular spot in Meditation 2, it comes into being, right? And so he distinguishes and he identifies himself with the thinking world, as opposed to the world in three-dimensional space, which he calls the world or realm of extension, meaning things that possess length, width, and height. Right. So he identifies himself with the thinking realm, and he associates himself with the thinking thing. Um, okay, so next he he basically, okay, so this is where meditation two essentially comes to an end, and meditation three begins. Now, meditation three begins, or this is when he has his first ontological argument for the proof of God. Uh, and we'll talk about what that means in a second, but let's see how he gets there first. So he says, okay, I know that I'm a thinking thing, right? But he wants to prove more than just that he is a thinking thing. He wants to show that the external world exists, that other concepts exist, and he says, well, what mode of thinking? There's many attributes to thinking. What mode of thinking um, seems to be the most accurate? And he has two sort of contestants for this. One is the intellect, the understanding, and the other is the imagination. And so, what the understanding does is it grasps uh, things conceptually. The imagination isn't necessarily what we think of when we uh, use the word imagination conventionally. Rather, what it is a envisionment of sensory perception, right? We have the information from the senses, and that summation of information is what our imagination is to Descartes. So when we see an object that has all um, sense data for all five senses, the five sense object that our mind constructs, it constructs from the imagination. And so here's a difference. He takes two concepts. One is the concept of wax, or two phenomenon rather, the phenomenon of wax and the phenomenon of a human being approaching from a distance. And we'll use the example of the human being approaching from the distance. In the distance, the imagination would think that the human being is basically a robot. He uses the word automaton, but there's nothing in the sensory experience of a human being off in the distance that would make one say, "Oh, that's a human being and not a robot," right? Because you can't perceive with the senses the mind of that uh, creature coming towards you. If you just use your imagination, which is just basically your sensory information, you would think that it was a robot and not a human being. It's the understanding or the intellect that allows you to say, ah, that is a human being, and I grasp the human being conceptually. You're not grasping what a human being is with the imagination, but rather you're grasping the human being conceptually with the understanding. And so he says, well, the understanding is what we utilize to understand concepts. So I'm going to say the understanding of the faculties of thinking is my best source of information here. Okay, so he goes with the understanding, and he says, well, what, in my opinion, makes a concept, according to my understanding, true. Now he's not sure if it's true yet, but he says, just what do I think when I grasp a concept with the understanding makes that concept true? And he says, well, if it's clear and distinct, that's what makes it true. And he says, well, let me think of the most clear and distinct concept there is. And here is where a lot of people perhaps initially part ways from Descartes. He thinks that the most clear and distinct concept that he could possibly think of is the concept of God, right? And let me give you two non-divine concepts to sort of make this clear. If you think of the concept of hot or cold, those two concepts aren't that clear and distinct, right? Cold could just be the absence of hot. Hot could just be the absence of cold. They're not clear and distinct the way, say, the concept of a triangle is clear and distinct. A triangle one can grasp merely conceptually. One need not experience any empirical reality to grasp the triangle. So, for example, you could say a triangle is three connected line segments whose sum of the interior angles is 180 degrees. And you've grasped the concept of a triangle thoroughly and completely in a very clear and distinct way. He meaning Descartes thinks that the concept of God is even clearer than that, is more clear and more distinct. And part of that concept is the infinite. So then he asks, well, how did this concept get in my mind? And he thinks that in order for this concept to have formed, right, it would need a formative cause. If you think back to Aristotle, Aristotle talks about the four causes, right? We have the material cause, the formal cause, the final cause, and the efficient cause. But he says in order for this concept to be formed, we would need a formal cause. And that formal cause would have to be at least as great as the cause itself. Now, again, we're not talking about the material realm. There is no material cause yet. It's just a formal cause. How could a concept like the concept of God be formed? And Descartes seems to think it would require something as at least as powerful, as significant as the concept of self itself. And through the understanding of the concept of God, it implies to Descartes that something as grand mentally as that concept must exist, and that concept itself is God. And so, with the concept of God for Descartes, you also now get the existence or a proof of the existence of God. And this is what an ontological argument is. It takes from the concept itself, you get the existence from the concept. And so this is the third, um, this is where the third chapter or meditation essentially ends. He makes one other concession, and that is that now that he has shown that God exists, he assumes that God is not a deceiver because that isn't aligned with the concept of God. And it's a bit of a debate right now on if he's importing traditional concepts or if it's purely illogical concept that he's proving. But but this is essentially the first three chapters of the meditation. So let me then summarize the next three chapters of the meditation. I'll do that in a moment. Thank you.